You're section one, okay? Yeah. So notice section one meets at 10 uh, o'clock, but right, the exam time is 10 to 11:50. Section two has their exam on Friday. Um, they've already been given this sheet of questions, but to be fair, I wanted to wait till Monday to give it to your class so that I don't give you all an extra weekend that they didn't have, you know. So, um, but you can see a lot of these are pretty straightforward. Again, it's the same deal. You just want to do one and hand it in the day of your exam, which is Monday the 15th. And I know this sounds threatening, but there's a reason why I make this disclaimer, and you'll find it should be at the bottom of this. I say your essay must be turned in by the end of the exam period in order to guarantee that it will be counted. And that goes for anything. I mean, you all probably don't owe me anything, but there still are a few people out there who owe me a late essay, like from test two or something. That so goes not only for your exam essay, but for anything else like the term paper. The only way I'm going to guarantee that something will be counted in your final grading is if it's physically in my hands by the end of the exam period. You know, so, and especially if, I mean, you can try emailing something that's late, but I'm fighting deadlines, and sometimes I'm so full with just getting all the calculations done, I don't have time to go mousing around on the internet making one last check for late papers. So at any rate, and you especially do not want to leave anything in my mailbox in 527. When I get through with y'all's exam, that's the last thing I have this semester. And unlike the full-time faculty, my contract does not go through the summer. So the next time I'll be on campus is the end of August. Like I say, that in the old days that used to happen. I'd come back in September and there would be a few late essays in my mailbox from May. Oh well. So anyway, okay. So we can do some review. I used to not give a separate review sheet. I used to tell students, look, the kinds of things I would ask objective questions on are also the kinds of things you would see essay prompts for. So, we went over Oedipus pretty detailed last time, so I'm not going to, most of this is pretty straightforward. So if the Oedipus story interests you, again, you'd want to follow it in your text. I do not have a supplemental reading there on that. Two also deals with fatalism. We saw several different aspects of fatalism, right? The ancient Greek view that the gods somehow have a fate in mind for us that is is written in stone and we're not going to change. That's the whole point of the Oedipus story, that no matter what decisions you make, they're going to be ineffective to change your fate. But we also looked at the view that the universe determines a fate for us via astrology. And there are a lot of people who sneak a peek at their horoscope nowadays. So we didn't look very much at the Hindu concept of karma, but it's out there. So two asked whether we ought to take any of these notions of fate seriously as, quote, sophisticated 21st century people, And I get answers both ways on that one. Now, how would the hard determinists reply? Now, of course, hard determinism, again, is the view of de Holbach. And that de Holbach reading, I don't summarize it. I probably should in a review sheet, but you would want to, review some of the basics of what he holds. That's the nice thing about underlining or highlighting stuff. You can review easily for a test because you look at what you highlighted. But how would a hard determinist reply to A, when I make a choice I could have chosen differently? Well, of course, their reply is, of course you could not have. If your causal past caused you to choose A this time, the same causal past would force you to choose A every time. So even though you thought you could deliberate and choose differently, you can't for the hard determinist. B, the fact that I have to deliberate before making a decision proves that I'm not determined. In other words, what do we do with this internal feeling that we really had a choice between doing A or doing B? Suppose you had a choice between going to Morgan and going to Coppin, and you chose Coppin. Well, but you thought I could just as easily have chosen to go to Morgan. For the hard determinist, this feeling that we have, this subjective feeling, is basically an illusion. We did not really have an option. So, the whole scenario of deliberating between should I choose A, should I choose B, should I go to Coppin, should I go to Morgan, for them that's just a charade. If you chose Coppin, you were determined to choose it by your causal past, and there was nothing you could do about it. So their answer to, the reply to hard determinism that, wait a second, we can really deliberate between two choices and choose one or the other is you only think you are. Number C, you can put it on top of the briefcase / backgammon set there. I didn't say that was backgammon set. Oh, okay. C, I'm going over, there's a hard copy of that as well as a review sheet if you haven't gotten it up on the desk. It is impossible to predict another person's behavior. Well, again, you can say impossible for whom? It might be impossible for Vic Morawski or one of you, but in principle, it's not impossible to predict someone's future behavior if you're a supercomputer or if you're Laplace's demonic entity that knows the position of every atom and molecule in the universe and can predict, can calculate the position of it at any future time because the laws of nature are that rigid. So the fact that we can't predict another person's behavior for a hard determinist does not show that that behavior was free, that the reason we couldn't predict their behavior was that people are genuinely making free choices and we can't predict ahead of time what choices they will make. For them, that's totally false. So, again, I'm going over this in some detail to also review some of the main points of that. Now, I'm not going to read question 4 in detail, but it asks you to weigh in on basically the main thing is that this focuses on hard versus soft determinism. And if committing that murder was really something they desired to do, wanted to do, Leopold and Loeb, well, would a soft determinist say, well, you know what, that's all we need for moral and legal responsibility? So could a soft determinist take a much harder line on Leopold and Loeb because a soft determinist says if we're motivated by some inner psychological state like a belief, a want, a desire, then because our behavior and our choices that are motivated that way are motivated internally, then for them that's enough free choice for moral responsibility for the soft determinists. Remember, soft determinism and compatibilism are just two names for the same thing, okay? And hard determinism and libertarianism is what Sartre's view is. It would have also been what Plato and Descartes held, that we are not determined by the laws of nature. And both libertarianism and hard determinism, even though they're at totally opposite ends of the spectrum as far as their believing whether, that we do or do not have free will, both libertarians and hard determinists agree on the thesis of incompatibilism. Basically, they say, if we're absolutely determined by the laws of nature, then that is incompatible with the claim that we have genuine moral responsibility. And, so both of them then are incompatibilists on that issue. But they come out differently, right? Because the hard determinist says, and we are determined, so we don't have moral responsibility. The libertarian says, we're not absolutely determined, so we do have moral responsibility, so let me go pass around a roll. Yeah, I'm going over, by way of review, since your exam is a week from today, the question sheet, which I have not given out yet. there is there is also a review sheet if you didn't get one that I passed out last time. And I collected the essays, so the term papers, so if you haven't turned yours in, you can either walk it up now or wait till the end of the period, but you don't want to forget. And today is 5/8/2017. Yeah, so remember, you will, be able to refer to printed materials during your exam. Remember, you have almost 2 hours, hour and 50 minutes, but no electronics, okay? So if you have notes or something, you want to print them out. Let me go pass this out. Okay. So that's all I'm going to say about this. Just for 5, you would want to look at the example I have in the PowerPoint of the Bentham's hedonic calculus. It gets called several things: calculus of pleasures, happiness calculus, hedonic calculus, all names for the same thing. Again, we're not talking about calculus in the sense that the calculus course talks about. Really, we're just adding positive and negative numbers. It's pretty simple middle school arithmetic here that we're doing. But if you're interested in writing on 5, basically it kind of requires you to develop your own example, similar to the one you see Bentham doing in the PowerPoint. Now 6 is straightforwardly a question dealing with the pros and cons of building a hydroelectric dam of the sort that you saw in the video. And again, you have the link to that video. So if you want to see this, I would review the video again. So anyway, that's the stuff, and again, for people who just came in, that's weird. I guess you're okay. Your exam is the first one listed here, since you're section 1, 10 to 11:50 on Monday, May 15th, so a week from today. Remember, you will need a Scantron for this. What was, and probably everybody heard this, but again, I take the disclaimer seriously on the bottom. There aren't any guarantees for anything that's not physically in my hands when I leave the exam room. And that goes especially for your class, since yours is the last exam that I have. Hold it. I'm trying to talk at the same time. Okay, I did some of the stuff at the beginning last time. I want to at least try to get through Sartre. So determinism basically says a unique past determines a unique future. And this is something that hard and soft determinism have in common. For both views, it is false that given the same causal past, a person could have chosen differently. And this is what makes you think, well, is that enough free will for me? You know, for both the hard and soft determinists, a unique causal past determines a unique a unique future. So, which is how hard determinism especially relates the past to the future. And again, I sort of just went over some of this stuff. For the hard determinists, they are incompatibilists. In other words, they hold the notion that we are determined by the laws of nature to be incompatible with the claim that we have enough free choice for moral responsibility. Of course, for them, we have no free choice, and hence no genuine moral responsibility. And this was the point of view of Clarence Darrow. You know, he took the hard determinist line. Soft determinism, we saw, combines the notion of determinism with the notion of freedom, and it sees them as compatible, but the way it sees them as compatible is by making a distinction between two kinds of freedom. Soft determinists agree with the hard determinists that we do not have what is called metaphysical freedom, that we do not have the freedom to go against what our causal history has determined for us, right? But there's another sense of freedom of choice that the soft determinist uses. And I used to not have much use for soft determinism at all, but it is true that the notion of free choice that they work with is the notion that's pretty much accepted in legal courts. In other words, if remember the Freddie Gray case. It's a good example where the question for the actual van driver was, and remember he was originally charged with what was called depraved heart murder. The thought was that he had an evil intention, an evil desire to actually do harm, if not kill, the suspect. And, you know, if we think people intended to do harm, that, you know, we want to hold them responsible for it in a more thorough way than if somebody, you know, accidentally did something or whatever that caused harm to someone. And so the soft determinists deny that we have metaphysical freedom. That is, we have no freedom from all of our choices being caused by our causal past and the laws of nature. But they say we have what some people call moral freedom. In other words, what they say is, if what we did was motivated by some inner psychological state we had, whether it's following a belief, a desire, a want, then if we did say what we desired to do, what we wanted to do, like, I got in here and I wanted to get some coffee, right? So you say, well, you acted freely. You desired to get some coffee and you did that and suffer the consequences, right? Uh, you know, but for the soft determinists, my desire was absolutely determined by my causal past. So there's a sense in which, given the same causal past, I would have had the same desire and acted on it and gotten coffee today. In other words, there's a sense in which I had no metaphysical freedom to not get a thing of coffee for the soft determinists. But they say if what we're doing, so what do they hold is a non-free action? Well, here again, usually it's something that comes about by external pressure, an external force. Either, say, the direct threat of violence, right? My example of somebody who just robbed a bank, commandeering your car with a gun in your ribs and forcing you to drive above the speed limit and, run red lights and stuff. Well, you were coerced. You weren't doing something you desired or wanted to do, and so we don't hold you responsible for that as a driver. So for soft determinists, then, unfree actions are actions caused by some external pressure, and it doesn't have to be the direct threat of violence. This gets into some controversial stuff, right? What if you're an accountant and your boss comes in and says, look, you sent me these figures for the quarterly report and they're bad. You need to doctor these up a little bit so we look better for the stockholders, And if you don't do that, you can start submitting your resume elsewhere, right? So now, under the threat of being fired, but to what extent do we want to hold the accountant, morally, not to be morally responsible? Because they could have chosen to act on principle and say, well, if that's what it comes to, then, consider this my resignation. But they don't. So, okay. So compatibilism, how it relates to personal responsibility and freedom, says we have moral freedom, freedom from done by an inner motivation, then we do have personal responsibility. So basically, for free actions, they have to be motivated by an inner. These two conditions, don't worry about that. That's from a different text. For what actions am I responsible according? Just TC stands for traditional compatibilism. I use a text that there are some refinements to this theory, but really all Solomon goes into is more or less what we consider traditional compatibilism. And for our purposes in Philosophy 101, that's enough. So what makes an action free or not forced? That it's done from some internal psychological motivation. how its concept of freedom and responsibility meshes well. Well, I said it does mesh well with the way we want to assign responsibility in a court of law, that somebody acted with a direct intention to do evil. We look at that as far more serious than if that isn't present. Well, okay. Never mind the last one. The last one goes into more modern theories that are compatibilism itself is the most complicated view on this. Again, Sartre really is surprising to me, but maybe it's not surprising when you consider his starting point. Right? For somebody like a de Holbach or a Laplace, and even in the 20th century, people like W.B.O. Quine, there have been philosophers throughout the history of philosophy that take what happens in the sciences very seriously, and that think what is happening in the sciences is something that they ought to absorb, and that their philosophy ought to reflect that. And so, people like de Holbach are saying, well, Newtonian science says everything in the universe is determined by strict laws down to the atomic level, and so shouldn't our philosophy reflect the fact that even human behavior and even human choices are utterly determined by causal laws? And so for the hard determinists, they take this inner conviction you and I have that we're really acting freely as simply an illusion. We're kidding ourselves, right? Whereas for Sartre, it's his starting point. He calls it subjectivity. I'm not going to ask you that term, but what he says is, well, look, Descartes started out from what's going on inside him, from his own subjective view of things, and Sartre says that's where I'm going to start. And so he places a lot of emphasis on this fact that you and I subjectively are convinced that we are really making free choices. So, well, again, the criticisms he's responding to are things like it makes morality totally relative, which we weren't looking at Sartre mostly for his theory of ethics, but also that it gives a very low view of human nature. Again, the two kinds of existentialists are basically religious and secular or atheistic existentialists. Sartre follows Nietzsche and Nietzsche's famous claim that God is dead. Of course, Nietzsche didn't mean that the God of the Bible and church tradition was once alive and unfortunately has passed away. But Nietzsche meant that God was never there to begin with, and that we, as sophisticated people in our own century, ought to just recognize that and get rid of the concept of God altogether, basically. And Sartre, so unlike a lot of religious people who believe that we're both a spirit or soul and a body, and because we're a dual entity, not all of what goes on inside us is subject strictly to the laws of nature, and we can have free choice. Sartre basically is an atheist, so I don't see how he can think that we have a soul, eternal or otherwise, and yet he thinks we make entirely free choices. Now, where choices come into play here is in the belief that all existentialists share that existence precedes essence. That is, that we first exist. There's no pre-existing human nature for existentialists. Descartes is wrong, Plato's wrong, that whole tradition. So Sartre says it's up to us individually and as a group, as human beings, to determine what our human nature is to be. And we do this, and this is where free will comes in, by freely choosing now to make those choices in the present that will realize some future goal. So note, this is a very important reason why Sartre thinks our actions are free and not determined by our causal past. One example he gives is of the Emperor Constantine when he was planning out Constantinople. What motivated him was a future vision, not his causal past. And what motivates us is, say, the future vision we have of, I want to go into public administration. I want to be a public school teacher. I want to be a nurse. That goal and the choices we make now are free choices that help make us into what we want to become. That's sort of Sartre in a nutshell. So free choice comes into play because that is how we determine our human nature, our essence, And he usually links this up with, like life's career goals and things like that. For Sartre, it was becoming a writer, So the first principle of existentialism is we're nothing but what we make of ourselves. And so he says we're totally responsible then for all of our choices because they're totally free. And to try to pretend that our choices are not free, to try to accept some kind of determinism, for him is to be in bad faith. Whether we hold that our choices are determined by our causal past, genetics, environment, the movement of atoms, or whether we try to claim that our choices are determined by a rigid morality, and he doesn't believe that any traditional morality holds. He says, if we pretend that we're not free and cite something else as the reason why we are what we are, he says we're acting in bad faith. One example he gives is somebody who's gay, and he comes down sharply on the side that says if they're gay, it's because of the choices they made, not their causal or genetic past. Now I realize this is a very controversial topic, but Sartre says the gay man is in bad faith, not because he's gay. Remember, Sartre has no traditional morality from which to say being gay is any worse than any other sexual option. But he says the gay man is in bad faith because he refuses to admit that it's his own life's choices that have made him that way. Now I realize there are other people who would come down on the side of genetics and environment in the idea of sexual orientation, but Sartre took the opposite point of view. I'm not asking you to agree or disagree with him, but to at least try to understand. So the gay man or any person is in bad faith if they pretend that their choices are not entirely free, that they're determined by something outside of themselves. Okay, remember to, 3 things. Number 2, pencil, Scantron form, and your test 3 essay. And yeah, if you haven't turned your paper in, just leave it up there in the front. And thank you very much for coming today. Okay. Oh, well, actually, we do have class Wednesday.
That's what I'm thinking. I'm not.
Oh, yeah, I should have said that. Well, I know I'm so focused on the. Yeah, and so I'll do some more
I'm going to bring that page back before you
review.
finish the next
Okay,
Friday.
if you want to. No, your exam is Monday. You gotta 2 things are. Remember that review sheet is for it. For the 11 o'clock class as well. They have their exam on Friday. You have yours a week from today.
Okay.
Yeah. So you want to keep that straight. Okay, you can go in. I'll be right back.